Hello, it's Michael again. So I was asked if I would share some thoughts about reincarnation. I suppose people, because of my admiration for Rudolf Steiner and Valentin Tomberg, that people might think I'm all in on reincarnation, but I'm not. It's not that I don't believe in reincarnation. I think it's probably true. I just don't know. I mean, I don't. I don't see how it works. And plus, the other thing is, I've seen so many stupid things said or pronounced or written about reincarnation, especially from a Western perspective, that I just kind of roll my eyes at it. I mean, who cares? Uh, but I think maybe it's incontrovertible proof. I mean, we know that in reincarnation, for instance, in Buddhism, and in particular in Tibetan Buddhism, that a lama may be coming near his death and he'll tell a couple, I will reincarnate as your child in X many years as a boy or whatever. And they do. And the way they test them is they bring the devotional instruments of that lama before the kid, and they put, like a dorje and a bell, for instance, and they'll put it on the floor in front of a little kid, I mean, like 18 months old, 2 years old, and put some other, you know, alternate dorjes and bells on the floor and see which ones the child goes to. And invariably, the child goes to this. And it's actually, I've been reading newspaper reports about this newspaper. I talk about dating myself. But I read this in the newspaper and magazines when I was a teenager. So it's been around for, I mean, and that was not the first time it had been reported on. So it's something that goes back that, so you got to take it seriously, I think. And I think, now there's a reason I'm not a Buddhist or a Hindu. I mean, as much as I do admire both of those faith traditions, I'm not, because I believe in grace. And where's the role of grace in reincarnation? And now, this is certainly something that Rudolf Steiner and Valentin Tomberg tried to address, but I'm not sure it's convincing. You know, I. But on the other hand, right? On the other hand, four fingers and a thumb. On the other hand, I think we do, as human beings, have. I mean, like, for instance, I have this memory that's not a memory, but going back to when I was a child, I had a feeling that I was really supposed to be a guy playing a lute standing next to a horse in kind of Renaissance garb or a medieval garb. I thought that's what I really was supposed to be, right? That was my self image. And when I was a young man, so I was 18, I think, I looked kind of like a figure from a Renaissance painting. In fact, my girlfriend and I, at the time, we went to the Detroit Institute of Arts and we were in the Renaissance room looking at stuff. And my hair was long and black. I had bangs. I didn't look like emo Phillips or anything, but my hair was long and black. I had an earring, and kind of, I don't think I had started really seriously shaving it, so I had kind of androgynous features, a little bit like you see in the youthful paintings of the Renaissance artists. And this older woman, she's probably my age now, she comes up to me. She says, "Young man, you look as though you just stepped right out of one of these paintings." And certainly I've always had this affinity for that time period, right? I don't know why, just have. Similarly, maybe around a couple of years later, I was probably 22, 23. Um, so I had a group of my friends. I was a musician at the time, and a lot of my friends were reading what is, ultimately a very bad novel, but it was very popular in those days, which The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley. So we were all reading, right? And several of the women in that group, young women, they're all in their 20s, had read it and they said, I think you're the reincarnation of Lancelot. They didn't know each other either. Actually, it's the ones who were saying this. They came to this conclusion independently of each other. But does that count as a scientific proof? I don't think so. Similarly, around the same time, I was dating a girl for a little while who was convinced I was the reincarnation of John Donne. And she even talked to a psychic who told her, yes, he is the reincarnation of John Donne. Now, interestingly, gosh, how many more years? 30 years later? Not that long, but almost 30 years later, 25 years later, I was writing my dissertation. And wouldn't you know it, that one of the chapters of my dissertation, which is now published as Literature and the Encounter with God in Post-Reformation England. What a boring title they made me choose. In that book, though, I have a chapter on John Donne and negative theology. And actually, that same girl, now a woman, found me somehow on the internet and found I was teaching at Marygrove College and found my faculty email and emailed me and said, what's it like to write a chapter on yourself? Now, here's the thing. I mean, I certainly can identify with both John Donne and Lancelot of the Morte d'Arthur, But what I can identify with, for instance, in Lancelot, right? And this is kind of my persona or my personality as a young man, who is kind of torn between amour, between love for Guinevere, and duty on the other hand, and morality. And then what happens? He becomes a religious nut. He loses his mind in Morte d'Arthur and becomes a kind of a crazy religious guy. And eventually, but then he comes out of that, and after the Battle of Camlan, he becomes a priest. So that's certainly something in my archetypal ballpark, right? And similarly with John Donne, in the film of the story of John Donne grew up in a Catholic family with a martyr pedigree. I think Thomas More, one of the more famous English martyrs, was a great uncle. I can't remember how exactly the relationship on his mother's side. And his mother's two brothers were part of the Jesuit mission in England, and Donne himself was probably catechized as a young man by none other than the metaphysical poet, kind of precursor to the metaphysical poets, Robert Southwell, who was also a Jesuit priest and who was executed for treason, for smuggling Catholic teaching and the Catholic sacraments into England. But Donne, so that's Donne's background, but also, I think he was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. I think he was present, if not in body, at least in spirit, in a way, when Robert Southwell was executed. And 20 years before, or so, maybe 15 years before, I am absolutely convinced that Donne's mother brought him to the execution of St. Edmund Campion. And, because that's what Catholic mommies did in those days in England, because here's a saint, right? And they would rub their handkerchiefs in the blood or whatever. It's kind of a macabre practice, but that's how Catholics roll, right? But I think Donne was traumatized by it, and so as a result, what he did as a young man, he was kind of the playboy of the Western world, and you read in his poems, The Flea, he's got all these amorous poems, and they're not necessarily love poems until later when he meets his wife, and then he writes these beautiful love poems. But eventually with him too, he becomes a priest in the Anglican Church after ruining his career prospects by a hasty elopement with the niece of his patron. So, but anyway, going back to reincarnation. So I can identify, especially as a young man, with those propensities toward religious devotion and interest in theological questions. And one great thing to look at is in, in Dunn's prose writing as well as poetry. He's always entertaining religion, theological questions. Why do we have to fight over this? Like in Essays in Divinity is a great example of that, where he's just puzzled on why are we fighting about the real presence in the Eucharist? If it's just a matter of semantics that we're quibbling over. And he's trying to find a way to peace, I think. But anyway, I could identify with both of those archetypes, we can call them, as a young man. And at the when people tell you that kind of thing, you're like, well, I'm kind of flattered, right? And I think there's a propensity to flatter ourselves about reincarnation, or even what we're doing is we're kind of creating a poetry about ourselves when we do this thing, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think you have to know you're doing it, right? There's a poetic truth to that, to my being the reincarnation of Lancelot and John Donne, though I don't think I really am, right? So that's kind of interesting, and there's a great point from Rudolf Steiner, and this is where it makes me crazy. Not just an individual's personal affinities, and with this or that figure, but when people just get damn stupid about reincarnation and who they were. So one of my favorite stories is Rudolf Steiner was giving a lecture one time, and a woman came up to him and said, they're talking about reincarnation, and she said, as a matter of fact, I am the reincarnation of Mary Magdalene. And Steiner looked at her, and he had a good sense of humor. He said, congratulations, you're the 25th Mary Magdalene I've met this lifetime, right? But I think that's what happens, is we get, we sense an affinity, and it's not a false affinity. But in Western context, and especially if you get a little bit of knowledge about reincarnation, it's probably a dangerous thing, and you can just come to stupid conclusions. And I should say, so another figure I had, and I still have, not really an affinity, but a fascination for, and in some part of me identifies with, is John the Baptist. And in my book, what the heck's the name? Meditations in Times of Wonder, my poetry manuscript that's out there. Many of the poems, I mean, I don't know, I wouldn't say half or even a quarter, but quite a few poems in there are really my transposing John the Baptist into my, geographical and historical context. What would it be like if at the time we were living in Sumter Township, Michigan, which is, kind of farmland, surrounded by woods, and what would it be if he were there? And so, but again, I'm not saying I was John the Baptist or John Donne or Sir Lancelot. In fact, we don't know if Sir Lancelot was a real guy. But the point is we have these affinities. Now, but Rudolf Steiner is really dogged about saying, reincarnation. You got to know reincarnation. When a child is in a class in a Waldorf school, it's they're bringing their past lifetimes with them, which is why in the 5th grade, I assume, the sweep of the ancient cultures comes up. So in a way, as the children are waking up to their intellect, they're kind of recapitulating their former existences on Earth. I mean, that's one way people look at it in the 5th grade, and it's beautiful. I mean, even if you don't look at it like that, it's still beautiful, right? But Steiner can get very pedantic about it. I know, he said something better, Rudolf Steiner. But he can, like for instance, where he says the process is you incarnate first as a man, then as a woman, then as a man, then as a woman. Though he says sometimes people, do 2 or 3 as the same sex, but I don't know what to do with that information, right? I do not know what to do with it. And here's something actually that Valentin Tomberg says, which is interesting, right? But it is human beings in whom these experiences of the past arise. It is therefore quite natural that they have much in common. In fact, as much in common as human beings have in common. For this reason alone, is it necessary to postulate the collectivity of subconscious or superconscious memory that spans millennia? Is it not more simple and natural to conclude that the one who remembers an experience is also the one who experienced it? It's worth thinking about, right? But what's the end game, right? What's the end game? You know, and I personally have also had memories, I don't want to call it imaginations of being wounded in war and taken care of by, and found and nursed back to health by like a convent, a group of women. Now I don't know what I don't want, I don't know where to hang that other than there is some. I mean, I think that directly speaks to the woundedness of our age and of my childhood for sure, but also the call to Sophia. I don't need to imagine a past lifetime. And here's the reason why. I had an argument. I was giving a talk on, I think it was Meditations in the Tarot, on at the Theosophical Society in Detroit 6 months ago, or maybe almost a year ago. And I got into an argument with a woman who was saying Christianity is bogus and Buddhism's true, and we have to learn from, from our past lives. Well, I haven't met one person who has learned anything, who remembers past lives and can learn from them. Because what's the point if reincarnating, if you're supposed to, learn from your mistakes that you made in the past, if you don't know what mistakes you made in the past? So that's kind of just dumb to me. Which is why, I like I said, I don't discount it. I discount the way people try to explain it, and they try to explain it, like Steiner. He tries to be scientific about it because in his age, this is what early 20th century occultism, late, the occult revival, they call it. You can see this in Blavatsky, especially The Secret Doctrine. She's taking the Darwinian evolutionary paradigm and applying it to occult science. And Steiner does the same thing in his book, Occult Science. And those are I don't know what to do with that information. I do not know what to do with that information. But I don't think it's science. I don't think there is a science, at least the way we conceive of science, of these things, of reincarnation. But I think there is a poetic metaphysics which might be more useful, at least more useful for people of my limited understanding and wisdom. But I think the thing is with that, you can get through the day with that. You can use that poetic metaphysic approach to reincarnation or past lives or whatever you're going to call it, because I think that then you can get something useful from it. Because otherwise, you never know. And the thing is with what Tomberg just said here, right? Is it not more simple and natural to conclude that the one who remembers an experience is also the one who experienced it? Well, no, not necessarily. People remember. Now, people remember things that didn't happen to them, right? We know this, right? It's not remembering. And it's conditioned by cultural circumstances. So, like back in the 70s, right? Everybody was telling stories about alien abductions. I was abducted by aliens. Well, it was in the culture, and people kind of it's kind of a form of mass hysteria in a way, where people they kind of knew the script, they knew what they're supposed to say, so, and for whatever psychological mechanism, they did it, right? So, and it's the same thing. Throughout history, social circumstances are often reflect in what people think are individual aspirations. I was just talking to students the other day about how in the 1970s and 80s, most criticism that you would read, academic criticism, say of artists or poets or whatever, was that they were all, if they were really, really good, like Michelangelo, or who else did they say this? Well, anybody, I can't remember the other example, but Michelangelo, for instance. Oh, really productive, must be a repressed homosexual, right? And everything. Then it was Lewis Carroll. Lewis Carroll was the one. He was interpreted as a repressed homosexual and a pedophile, and so was J.M. Barrie. But that was kind of, you can't tell if they really were or really weren't, because it's so conditioned by, the kind of fads and fashions and academic scholarship, which is nuts. It's kind of silly. I mean, they always tell you, right? You don't want to know how sausage is made, and so that's academia. You just don't know what's going on. It's these people are not they might have PhDs, but they're usually not very smart in when it comes outside of their little particular area of knowledge. So anyway, that's about all I wanted to say about reincarnation. Though, like I said, I'm open to the idea. I like the idea of reincarnation. I don't like the idea of it being like a balance sheet. Okay, let's check this off. Let's see how your accounts are. I don't like that at all. I don't think it's useful. And it's counter to the idea of grace. And this is something that Tomberg tries to get, or he does get into in Meditations on the Tarot. The importance of the single life, right? I don't mean one lifetime, not living single. And like I said, I like the idea of reincarnation. I think it might be true, but the way I've seen it applied, it just it just turns me off. It's lacking something. But anyway, so those are my thoughts. What are your thoughts about this? And I would love you, to drop some comments in the comment box down below, or share with me your own experiences. Maybe I'm sure a lot of people know more than I do about this, but and these are just my opinions. This is not like, I don't think you can research your past lives. I mean, in fact, I think I did that before. I was trained as a past life regressionist by this one dude back in I forgot all about that. I don't remember anything I did with that, but it didn't, even then, it's a lot of it just seemed kind of dopey. Sorry. Oh gosh, the stories I can tell. But anyway, share your thoughts, your experiences, and let's keep the conversation going. If there's anything else you'd like me to talk about, let me know. You can see a link to my Patreon down below in the description, and my Substack. So go ahead and see you next time. Bye-bye.